Finally, I'm free from that burden. Starting today, my parents are moving in with me at my house. When my parents passed away, my husband, Scott, made an unthinkable decision. He demolished our family home. As we stood in front of the empty lot where it once stood, he blurted out, "Hurry up and bring the inheritance to our place." I froze, completely stunned by his words.
What are you talking about?
"Have you lost your mind?" I asked, still trying to process what he'd just said. Then, as the weight of the situation hit me, I couldn't help but laugh. At that moment, everything became clear. This was never about grief or honoring my parents' memory. It was about the money. My laughter seemed to confuse him. "Why are you laughing? Don't you understand?" Scott and my in-laws looked at me with a mix of frustration and confusion. That's when I told them. The truth is, my name is Amy Jackson. I was born as the eldest daughter in a family of ordinary office workers. I have one brother, and we grew up in a simple, normal household. At 30, I married Scott, and together, we had 2 wonderful kids. Life was a juggling act between work and parenting, but before I knew it, I was 52. By then, our son Eric and daughter Judy had grown into independent adults, each carving out their own paths in life and careers. It seemed like the perfect time for Scott and me to slow down and enjoy a quieter, more relaxed phase of life together. It was an ordinary existence, but I was content. I believed this was how I would gracefully age, peaceful, happy, and fulfilled. But everything changed one day, and my simple life took a dramatic turn. It was a cold winter day when tragedy struck. My father was in a car accident and passed away suddenly. He was only 68. The shock and grief consumed our entire family, but it was my mother who suffered the most. She fell into such deep depression that she couldn't even bring herself to eat. Mom, I know it's hard, but you have to eat," I urged her repeatedly. "I know," she replied in a frail voice, "but I just don't have the appetite."
It feels like there's something stuck in my chest.
At first, my brother and I assumed it was her grief taking a physical toll, so we kept a close eye on her. But within just 3 weeks, her condition worsened. She began losing weight at an alarming rate. Worried, I decided to take her to the hospital, where the doctor delivered a devastating diagnosis: cancer. It was advanced, and surgery wasn't an option. They estimated that my mother had about a year left to live. The news hit me like a tidal wave. I hadn't even had the chance to truly care for my parents yet. First, I lost my father suddenly, and now my mother was facing this cruel illness. The grief was overwhelming, even more than when my father had passed. But I knew I couldn't allow myself to drown in despair forever. Someone had to step up. My brother lived far away and couldn't provide much support, so the responsibility fell to me. I made up my mind and told Scott, "I want my mother to live with us. I can't leave her alone, not now."
Both.
Emotionally and physically, I knew my mother would need all the support I could give during her illness. But Scott's reaction caught me off guard. "We just finished dealing with your dad's funeral, and now I have to be dragged into more of your family's issues?" he said with a heavy sigh, his tone dripping with annoyance. I stared at him, stunned. "You don't have to say it like that. Can't you just drive her to the hospital and back? Does she really have to live with us?" I asked, trying to reason with him. "I think she might feel lonely if she's by herself. If it's too much, maybe I could just stay at my family home for a while to care for her," I suggested gently. But Scott's face darkened, and he shot back indignantly. "And who's going to take care of my meals? Who's going to make sure the house is clean? While you're gone, I'll come back and cook, of course," I said, trying to reassure him. Scott, however, wasn't satisfied. "What about cleaning? Who's going to do the laundry?" he demanded, his frustration clear. I fell silent. I had every intention of doing what I could, but I knew I couldn't keep up with everything the way I had before. His words stung deeply, forcing me to confront a painful reality. If someone called me selfish for wanting to care for my mother, I wouldn't have had an argument to defend myself. I knew my mother, being as considerate as she was, would tell me everything was fine as it was. But deep down, I desperately wanted to do something for my parents while I still could. Fine, Scott finally said with a cold edge in his voice, but I'm not helping with anything. You hear me? Grudgingly, Scott muttered his agreement to my silence. His attitude was arrogant, but at least he had agreed. I'm sorry and thank you, I said, swallowing my frustration. As awful as I thought he was being, he had still granted my wish. Suppressing the urge to argue further, I chose to express gratitude instead. And so, despite the tension, Scott and I moved into my family home to live with my mother. Previously, we had been living in a house provided by Scott's employer. Being an only child, Scott was expected to eventually move in with his own parents, as his father had always wanted us to live together. Because of this, we hadn't planned to buy a home of our own. Living in company housing had been convenient for Scott's work, and the rent, which was only about $11,000 a month, wasn't much of a financial strain. However, now that we had moved to my family home, we no longer had to pay rent, and the larger space felt like an added bonus. I thought maybe in some ways, living together wouldn't be so bad for Scott. True to his word, though, Scott didn't lift a finger to help. Even so, I was grateful for the chance to care for my mother. She tried to stay upbeat, but her health often left her feeling weak, and she spent much of her time lying down during the day. I took on the responsibility of preparing her meals, feeding her, and managing her medication. It was exhausting, but knowing I could be there for her made it all worthwhile. It would have been impossible for my mother to manage everything on her own. I'm sorry, Amy. Thank you. It's such a big help having you here with me. I should thank Scott too, my mother said, her gratitude heartfelt. She didn't know the harsh things Scott had said about living together, so she was thankful to him as well. Hearing her kind words only added to the weight I carried. One evening, after my mother had gone to bed and Scott returned home, I decided to bring up her treatment during dinner. While placing his plate in front of him, I began to speak, but Scott immediately glared at me. I don't know what you want me to say. I told you. I'm not helping with anything, he snapped, cutting me off before I could even finish. His refusal to listen left me feeling crushed. All I wanted was someone to talk to, someone to confide in. Even if he didn't offer a solution, I needed him to just listen. But Scott remained cold and indifferent. As the weeks turned into months, his attitude didn't improve. 2 months, 3 months went by, and he continued to complain about living with my mother, acting as though he was doing me some monumental favor. His behavior only became more obnoxious as time passed. But I couldn't bring myself to argue with him. Between worrying about my mother's health and trying to be considerate of Scott's feelings, the stress was eating away at me. Around the time we approached my mother's 2-year prognosis, her condition worsened rapidly. Watching her deteriorate broke my heart, and I knew the hardest days were yet to come. And just like that, my mother was hospitalized. 5 days later, she passed away. Even though I had tried to prepare myself mentally, the loss hit me like a tidal wave. I was utterly devastated. My brother's family and my children arrived right away, offering comfort and helping with the arrangements. But during moments like these, more than anything, you yearn for the support of your spouse. Scott, however, was far from the partner I needed. While we were scrambling to organize the funeral, he stood in the corner, laughing and chatting with his parents, completely uninvolved in the preparations. My brother had to step up, taking on the lead role in handling everything, and somehow, we managed to get everything ready for the funeral. But when the service began, Scott wasn't sitting with the family where he should have been. Instead, he sat in the very back of the relative section. Scott, I want you to sit in the family section, I said, approaching him quietly. He looked up and replied dismissively, No, I'm fine here. I'm not a blood relative after all. His words stung. But you're my husband, I said, trying to reason with him. Before he could respond, his mother interjected sharply. He's your husband, sure, but he's not your mother's son. Scott is our son, so of course, he's an outsider to your family. I froze at her cruel words. Amy should sit in the family section alone, she added matter-of-factly. Hearing this from my in-laws was like a dagger to my heart. I was left completely speechless. Where I come from, It's customary for sons-in-law to sit in the family section at funerals. Of course, I knew customs could vary by region, but this wasn't about tradition. It was about respect. And Scott, along with his family, had made it clear just how little they had for mine. With Scott absent from the family section, distant relatives began whispering, speculating if we had divorced. It was humiliating. Gossip was one thing, but the whispers could have been avoided entirely if Scott had simply sat where he belonged. Feeling hurt and frustrated by his absence, I pushed those emotions aside and focused on saying a proper goodbye to my mother. Despite everything, we managed to see her off peacefully. After the funeral, my brother's family, my children, Scott, and his parents returned to my family home. Trying to be a gracious host, I thanked my in-laws. "Thank you for coming, especially during such a busy time," I said, offering them tea. They laughed and responded flippantly. "Well, it's something, isn't it? First your father, and now your mother. These funeral expenses are such a burden for us, too. But at least that's the end of it." Their words left me stunned.
What do they mean by that?
I thought, disbelief washing over me. How could they say something so callous? Forcing a polite smile, I quickly excused myself to avoid breaking down in front of them. As I stepped away, I overheard Scott talking with his parents in a hushed but distinct tone. "It must have been tough for you, Scott, living with outsiders," his mother said. "Yeah," Scott replied, "dealing with Amy's whims was such a pain. A husband shouldn't just follow his wife's demands. If you don't like something, you have every right to refuse." Hearing those words was the final blow. My chest tightened as anger and sadness welled up inside me. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my emotions in check. After everything I had been through, the loss, the stress, the sacrifices, I couldn't believe Scott would speak about me this way, especially to his parents. Their voices, laughing and chatting without a care, were unbearable. But this wasn't new. Scott's parents had always been rude and insensitive. When Scott and I got married, his mother remarked, "Couldn't you find someone more attractive? I guess I can't expect much for grandchildren." His father, trying to be funny, added, "Well, they say beauty gets boring after 3 days, but with Amy, you won't get bored." And what had Scott done? He had laughed along with them. Reflecting on those moments now, I realized neither Scott nor his parents had offered me a single kind or comforting word, not during my father's funeral, and certainly not after my mother's passing. Instead, they had treated me with ridicule and disrespect, even in my darkest times. For so long, I had felt guilty for burdening Scott by asking to care for my mother. I had been so worried about imposing on him, too focused on trying to maintain peace in our relationship, and just wanting to do right by my parents. But now I questioned Scott's behavior, not just as a husband, but as a person. Why had I felt so guilty when he had shown no support or compassion at all? I sat there, simmering in anger, as Scott and his parents continued their thoughtless laughter in the other room. If my brother's family or my kids had overheard them, they would have been furious. Thankfully, they were in the kitchen, away from the commotion. For now, I was relieved to be the only one who had to hear Scott and his parents' cruel words. But that didn't make their behavior any less painful. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had to change. Scott's mother suddenly called out, "Amy." Startled, I turned to her. "Yes," I replied hesitantly. "Can I have this?" she asked, holding up my mother's purse. I froze, confused. "Oh, well." Before I could gather my thoughts, she added casually, "Your mother won't be needing it anymore, right?" Scott suggested I take it home. "Maybe I'll just keep it." She turned the purse over in her hands, inspecting it like it was a bargain find at a store. I couldn't believe her audacity. This was right after the funeral, no less. Summoning my resolve, I took the purse from her and said firmly, "No, you can't." Her expression shifted, not from the loss of the purse, but from shock that I, her daughter-in-law, had dared to stand up to her. But I didn't back down. "We're not ready to sort through my mother's belongings yet," I added, my voice steady. "We'll distribute her keepsakes among the family later." Her face turned bright red with anger. "What do you mean?" she snapped. Are you saying I'm an outsider? I stared at her, my own frustration boiling over. You said earlier at the funeral that even Scott was an outsider to my mother. How come Scott is an outsider, but your family isn't? I retorted, my voice sharp with indignation. Scott and his father turned red as well, clearly furious. What are you saying? Apologize to Mom. Scott barked. How disrespectful of a daughter-in-law to talk like that. The escalating argument drew everyone from the kitchen and other rooms. My brother's family and my children entered, their faces full of concern and confusion as they tried to make sense of the commotion. But I stood my ground, unwilling to let them shame me for protecting my mother's memory and her belongings. And I was left standing there, stunned. I hadn't expected to be labeled an outsider after all the effort I had put into hosting and organizing the funeral. Let's go home, Dad. My mother-in-law shouted at Scott's father, her voice sharp with anger, before storming out of the house. For some reason, Scott was also upset. Without a word to me, he followed his parents out. Once they were gone, everyone who had witnessed the scene turned to me, puzzled. What happened? Did you really call your mother-in-law an outsider? They asked, their curiosity tinged with disbelief. I could see how, taken out of context, it might have sounded like I was the one being harsh. But I calmly explained the full situation, including the disrespectful comments and actions that had led up to that moment. As I spoke, understanding dawned on their faces. Not a single person blamed me. Grandpa and Grandma should be more considerate of other people's feelings, one of my children said with a sigh. That's just how Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa have always been, my other child added, siding with me completely. Even with their support, I couldn't shake my anger. I couldn't forgive Scott, his mother, or his father for their behavior. What made it worse was that Scott hadn't come home since that day, nor had I reached out to him. I didn't see why I should apologize, and deep down, I wasn't sure I could forgive him even if he returned. Still, I knew things couldn't go on like this forever. Then one day, Scott walked through the door. Welcome home, I said, my voice even, though I felt anger bubbling under the surface at the mere sight of him. It's been tough, huh? Scott said gruffly, his attempt at showing concern catching me off guard. I looked at him, unsure how to respond as he continued, Take the kids and go on a trip. It'll be a good change of scenery for you. He handed me a set of travel vouchers. For a moment, I was speechless. Then, without warning, tears started streaming down my face. Whether it was the kids' idea or not, I was touched that Scott had gone along with it. I quickly contacted the kids to plan the trip. Really? Dad suggested this? Judy asked, her voice filled with disbelief. It's surprising, isn't it? I replied, laughing softly. It seemed like the vouchers really were a gift from Scott, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of warmth toward him. I wonder if Dad feels bad about what happened, Judy mused. Maybe, I said with a chuckle, though I couldn't say for sure. Gratefully, I accepted the travel vouchers from Scott. I'll be off then, I said as I prepared to leave. Yeah, take your time, he replied. Stay with the kids at their places too, why not? Really? I can't be away that long.
Don't worry about me.
I'll relax at my parents'. Just enjoy yourself. And with that, Scott sent me off. Judy was thrilled to have me visit, so before heading to the spa trip, I stopped by her place first. Afterward, I went to Gary's. I hadn't had much of a chance to visit them while caring for my mother, so it felt good to spend time together again. To help out, I cooked and froze meals for both of them. Small gestures of love that brought us closer. Mom, you didn't have to go to all this trouble, Judy said with a smile, but I could see she appreciated it. You should relax, but thanks, this really helps, both Judy and Gary said, delighted to have my home-cooked meals stocked in their freezers. I felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing this opportunity to reconnect with my kids had been made possible thanks to Scott's suggestion. Then came the long-awaited spa trip. My children and I enjoyed a peaceful time at the hot springs, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I felt the weight of caregiving and the sorrow of losing my parents begin to lift. I was away for almost a week, and when it was time to leave, both Judy and Gary returned to their homes with bright, content smiles. That was fun. We should thank Dad for once, Judy said with a playful grin. True, just this once, Gary agreed before adding, but I wonder if he's up to something. Don't say that. I laughed. Dad thought about us in his own way. Feeling hopeful, I returned home, ready to share the happy memories with Scott and perhaps start afresh as a couple. But as I approached the house, I froze in disbelief. What, the house is? I muttered, looking around in shock. It was unmistakably the same location, yet the family home, the home where I had lived with my parents, was gone. My heart pounded as Scott suddenly appeared, followed closely by his parents. They were grinning as if they had achieved something monumental. Scott, what's going on? I asked, my voice trembling as I struggled to understand. With the same sickening smile on his face, Scott replied coldly, Finally, I'm rid of that burden. Baggage, Scott finished with a smirk. Starting today, my parents are moving in with me at my house. I stared at him, trying to keep my composure. What are you talking about? I replied, my voice shaking. Have you lost your mind? Scott's grin widened. Your family home has been demolished. Bring the inheritance to our place quickly. Whatever you inherited, it's mine now. The truth hit me like a freight train. The disappearance of the family home, the smug expressions, it was all Scott's doing. He had destroyed my parents' house, driven by greed for the inheritance he assumed I had received. Betrayal doesn't begin to describe what I felt in that moment. On my way home, I had tried to imagine how our future might unfold, but now I was overwhelmed by an indescribable mix of sadness and fury. But no, demolishing the house won't go Scott's way. I won't let it. I stared at their gloating faces and, without thinking, burst into laughter. My reaction stopped them in their tracks, confusion replacing their smugness. Why are you laughing? Scott asked, narrowing his eyes. What a strange woman, my mother-in-law muttered, her gaze filled with disdain. Has she gone crazy? Still laughing, I turned to face all three of them. Don't you guys know what you're talking about? I said, barely containing another laugh. I haven't inherited a single penny. There's no inheritance. Their faces froze, the weight of my words sinking in. The smug certainty they'd carried evaporated, replaced by shock and confusion. I couldn't stop myself and burst into laughter again. Their wild assumptions, their greedy scheming, it was all based on a fantasy. They had demolished my family home, thinking it would make them rich. And now, their grand plans were crumbling before their eyes. Their absurd actions had me laughing uncontrollably. What do you mean? Explain yourself. Scott demanded, his voice rising with frustration. But I didn't respond. I saw no need to enlighten them. Instead, I turned to Scott and said, I'm not going to live with strangers. If you want to live together with your parents, go ahead, alone. Ignoring Scott's question and flatly rejecting his suggestion made my mother-in-law's face flush with anger. You helped with your parents' housework, but you can't do ours? You're aware of the circumstances, aren't you? I agreed to live together, didn't I? She yelled, her voice dripping with indignation. I told you I didn't want to live together, I shot back. Have you forgotten? You chose to live together just to avoid housework. I refuted them one by one, my frustration finally boiling over. And demolishing the family home like that? There are things you just shouldn't do. I yelled, my voice firm. Without waiting for their response, I turned on my heels and walked away. Behind me, Scott called out, Where are you going? But I didn't look back. The last thing I wanted was to see his face right now. I needed space, a place to stay for the night, and, most importantly, a plan to deal with this mess. Without hesitation, I contacted a lawyer. Demolishing a house couldn't possibly be that simple, especially since the house wasn't even Scott's to begin with. It was still in my mother's name. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mother's name, I replied firmly. You destroyed my precious house, so of course, you have to compensate for it. Compensate? Scott shouted, his voice filled with indignation. We said we were moving to my house. What's the big deal? The arrogance in his tone only fueled my anger. The big deal is that you demolished a house that wasn't yours, Scott. My mother's house, her home. You planned it all, even tricking me into leaving with those travel vouchers so you could pull this off behind my back. Did you really think you wouldn't face consequences? Scott was momentarily silent, likely trying to come up with an excuse or a way out of the mess he had created. But I didn't let him off the hook. The lawyer had explained everything clearly to me. Scott's actions, along with his father's involvement, were a serious legal offense. Demolishing a property without the rightful owner's consent was not only a civil matter, but a criminal one. Charges of property destruction and liability for damages could lead to severe consequences for Scott and his parents. And that was exactly what I intended to pursue. The tears I had cried earlier were replaced by a newfound determination. I wouldn't let Scott, his father, or his mother get away with what they'd done. Not just to me, but to the memory of my family's home. I suggest you take that letter seriously, I said coldly, because this isn't going away until justice is served. Scott sputtered something unintelligible, but I hung up before he could continue. I had wasted enough time on him and his selfishness. Now it was my turn to take control. Scott's arrogance was infuriating as he continued. I demolished a house that nobody was going to live in. You should be thanking me, not asking for compensation. Now bring the inheritance and come back home. Thank you for demolishing my house? Don't make me laugh. I shouted back, my voice trembling with anger. And what inheritance? It's not even settled yet. For a moment, Scott was silent, taken aback by my rare display of rage. The reason I laughed when the house was demolished, I said coldly, was exactly this. I had a whole year with my mother. Of course, we discussed matters of inheritance. I told my brother I didn't want anything and to give it all to him. As a result, he inherited all the cash and stocks. But my brother insisted I keep the house. Since he lives far away and couldn't manage it, we agreed it could be rented out if I wasn't going to live there. That was the plan, Scott. And you destroyed that. I took a deep breath, my anger sharp and cutting. So here's what's going to happen. Either you and your father restore the house to its original state or you pay the amount specified in the legal notice. I was considering settling this amicably, but if you refuse, fine. If you can't pay, I'll file a police report and sue you both for property destruction. Scott's bravado began to crumble, and his voice faltered. I'm sorry, he muttered, his arrogance evaporating. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Sorry won't fix the damage you've done, I said firmly. You better start figuring out how you're going to make this right. I didn't think you'd get so angry, Scott said, beginning to stumble over his excuses. Of course, I'm angry. What do you expect? I snapped, cutting him off. It all became clear to me then, Scott's real motivation. He had demolished my family home, believing that with it gone, I would feel forced to move in with his parents. His father had always wanted us to live together and had a particular fondness for Eric, our son. Scott had previously refused to live with them, using his work commute as an excuse, but his parents mistakenly thought I was the one against it. To win them over, Scott concocted this cruel plan. By demolishing my house and pretending I'd bring the inheritance with me, he made it seem like I would finally move in with them. It was manipulative and heartless, and I couldn't forgive him for it. Please give me a break. I didn't mean any harm, Scott pleaded weakly. Dad's sorry too. If he's truly sorry, then agree to the settlement. I replied coldly and hung up the phone before he could say another word. Scott began bombarding me with calls and messages, all filled with apologies and excuses. But I wasn't interested in his words anymore. If you're sorry, just transfer the money, I responded bluntly, shutting him out. I knew my childhood home couldn't be restored, and no amount of compensation could truly heal the loss. But pursuing the settlement was the only way I could cope with my overwhelming feelings of betrayal and sorrow. For now, I stayed at Judy's place, surrounded by her warmth and support. My brother's family and my children were aware of the situation, and while my brother must have been furious about what happened to the house, he chose not to overwhelm me with his anger. Instead, he focused on being there for me just as my children did. Together, We faced this mess, finding strength in one another even as the hurt lingered. He had taken my mother's belongings and was selling them online. I can't believe this, I muttered, my heart sinking as I stared at Judy's phone screen. The apron was unmistakable, a one-of-a-kind piece I had made for my mother with my own hands. Grandma's things, all of them, Judy said, scrolling through the listings. Nearly 50 items were listed, and every single one was familiar to me. Jewelry, keepsakes, even everyday items that held sentimental value. They were all there. The seller had just joined the flea market app with no transactions or reviews. But I knew immediately who it was. "It's Scott," I said through gritted teeth, my voice trembling with anger and disbelief. Judy looked at me, horrified. Why would he do this? How could he? I couldn't even begin to answer. My emotions were a storm of rage and sadness. Not only had Scott destroyed my family home, but now he was trying to profit off my mother's belongings, things that were precious to me, to my family. "This is unforgivable," I said firmly, taking out my phone. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I immediately reported the listings on the app and took screenshots of everything as evidence. Then I contacted my lawyer to inform them of this new development. As I explained the situation, the lawyer reassured me. This is another clear violation. Selling property without consent, especially items that were part of your family's estate, is illegal. We'll add this to the case. Judy placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "We're gonna get through this, Mom. Don't let him drag you down." Her support strengthened my resolve. Scott had already taken so much from me, but I wouldn't let him take anything more. It was time to fight back, harder than ever. Nervous look glanced back at his mother as if seeking support. "Selling her belongings?" Scott's mom repeated, her laughter echoing through the doorway. "That's ridiculous. Why would Scott do such a thing?" Judy, unshaken, crossed her arms and shot back. "That's what we're here to find out. Dad's the only one who could have taken them after the house was demolished. There are nearly 50 of Grandma's things listed on a flea market app, and they're unique items we all recognize." Scott's father, hearing the commotion, stepped outside as well. "What's this all about?" he asked, frowning. I fixed my gaze on Scott. "Where are my mother's belongings?" I demanded again, my voice steely. "I told you I don't know anything about it." Scott stammered, his words lacking conviction. "Dad, stop lying," Judy snapped. "If it wasn't you, then who else could it be?" The tension was palpable. Scott's mother's smile faltered as Judy's accusation landed. She glanced between her son and me, her expression turning defensive. "Now hold on a second," she said. "Are you blaming us for this? That's outrageous. Maybe you misplaced those things. Or maybe someone else took them after the demolition." "That's impossible," I replied firmly. The only people with access to the property after the house was destroyed were Scott and his father. Scott's father looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. Scott, meanwhile, broke into a cold sweat, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Enough games," I said, raising my voice. "If you don't admit the truth and give me back my mother's belongings right now, I'll escalate this legally. Selling someone else's property is theft, and I won't hesitate to involve the police." Judy, standing resolute beside me, added, "Grandma's things are not yours to take or sell, Dad. You're embarrassing yourself. Just tell the truth." The pressure mounted as Scott's excuses crumbled. His parents exchanged uneasy glances, and Scott finally muttered, Okay, I'll cancel the listings." "Canceling isn't enough," I snapped. "You'll also return every single item, and you better hope they're all intact." Scott nodded reluctantly, his head hanging low. His parents didn't say another word as Judy and I stepped past them into the house to ensure everything would be retrieved. I wouldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. Scott's mother's loud admission sent a chill down my spine. "Scott is selling them? That's impossible. I'm the one selling them," she declared, her voice chipper, as if she'd just revealed a harmless secret. My heart sank as I looked at her, utterly stunned. Scott stood frozen, his guilty expression practically screaming, "This is bad." Judy, beside me, was equally shocked, her mouth falling open in disbelief.
What?
Judy managed to say, her voice trembling. Oh, it's a lot of work, you know. Scott's mother continued cheerfully, completely oblivious to the gravity of what she was admitting. I have to pack everything carefully, take good photos, and manage the listings on the app. But it's fun. I finally found a hobby I enjoy. I clenched my fists, struggling to hold back the surge of anger and frustration building inside me. Cancel the listings, I said, my voice trembling with restrained fury. Those are not yours to sell. Judy, with tears in her eyes, pleaded. Grandma, please. Those are Grandma's things. How could you do this? Scott's mother frowned, clearly displeased with our reaction. What's the big deal? I'm using the things I can and selling the rest for a little pocket money. It's good for preventing dementia, she said, brushing off the accusations. Then, as if to justify her actions further, she added with a self-satisfied smile, I'm the only grandma left, so Judy wants me to stay healthy and live long, right? Her nonchalant tone and utter lack of remorse were infuriating. Judy's voice cracked as she begged, please stop this. Just stop. But Scott's mother didn't seem to care. Her dismissive attitude made it painfully clear that reasoning with her was pointless. I knew I couldn't let this slide, not when she had crossed such an unforgivable line. If talking wouldn't work, then stronger action would. I stepped forward and said firmly, if you don't cancel every single listing and return those items immediately, I'll be filing a police report. Selling stolen goods isn't a hobby, it's a crime. Scott opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when I shot him a glare. Don't even try to defend this, I snapped. You knew about it, didn't you? You stood by and let this happen. His silence confirmed my suspicion, and the weight of his mother's actions and his complicity settled heavily in the room. I wasn't leaving without taking steps to make things right. This had gone far enough. And your father must take responsibility for demolishing the house. This isn't just going to go away, I said firmly, my voice heavy with anger and exhaustion. Scott stammered on the other end of the line. But we're family, right? Can't we just work this out? Please, withdraw the report. Family? I repeated bitterly, the word almost catching in my throat. You still haven't paid a single cent of compensation for the house. Not alimony either. And on top of that, there's no remorse, none. You think family justifies stealing and destroying everything I held dear? Think again. My shouting left Scott stunned into silence. After a moment, he muttered, I didn't know she was selling it.
I swear.
But I'll do something, okay? Despite everything, I felt a pang of sadness. I had spent so many years with this man, sharing my life and building a family. Part of me still had feelings for him, even after all the pain he had caused. Letting out a long sigh, I softened my tone slightly. Scott, I'll wait for the compensation, but I won't forgive the theft.
Return everything.
And tell your father to step up. What you both did to my family's home was unforgivable. If you really want to fix this, cooperate with the investigation and take responsibility for once in your life. There was a long pause before Scott mumbled, okay. I'll try. I hung up, unsure whether to believe him but too drained to dwell on it. At least with the police involved, there was some hope of recovering my mother's belongings. Judy, who had been quietly walking beside me, finally spoke up. Mom, I'm proud of you, she said, her voice filled with warmth. Grandma's things meant so much to you and all of us. You didn't let them take that away. Her words brought tears to my eyes, but this time, they were tears of relief. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was taking a step toward reclaiming what was left of my family's legacy and my own strength. The hospital, after all. I learned through Judy, who had heard it from Scott, that his father had been diagnosed with a serious illness. The news left me conflicted. On one hand, I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for someone who had been so cruel and dismissive, especially after his hurtful words about my parents. On the other hand, I had only pointed out his condition out of genuine concern, and now his health was proving to be a real issue. When Scott's father called me to berate me for suggesting he was unwell, I had been furious at his arrogance. His words about my parents, comparing their passing to weakness and using it to insult me, had stung deeply. I had barely managed to bite my tongue and say, "Sorry for overstepping. I was just worried." "Humph," he had huffed dismissively. "I'm not frail or short-lived like your parents. Don't make a fool of me." The conversation had left me fuming. Yet now, knowing he had finally sought medical attention, I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of irony. For all his bravado, reality had caught up with him. Scott called me a few days later to deliver the news himself. "Dad's sick," he admitted hesitantly. "The doctors are saying it's serious. He's blaming you, you know." "Blaming me?" I replied incredulously. "For what? For noticing what his own family ignored? For caring enough to say something?" Scott sighed on the other end. "I don't know. He says you cursed him, or something ridiculous. Look, I don't know what to do right now. Can you?" "Can I what, Scott?" I interrupted, my patience worn thin. "Do you really think I'm going to swoop in and fix everything? Your family has done nothing but insult, betray, and hurt me." I pointed out what I saw because someone had to. If he hadn't been so stubborn, maybe this could have been addressed earlier. There was silence on the line. I wasn't sure if Scott was processing my words or just avoiding another argument. "Just take care of your father," I said finally, my tone weary. "For once, take responsibility for your family." I hung up, feeling a mix of anger, exhaustion, and relief. It wasn't my burden to carry anymore. For too long, I had shouldered the weight of Scott's family's actions and attitudes. Now I was focused on rebuilding my own life, free from their toxicity. Strange and unexpected decision, but it made sense in its own way. Scott's father had always shown a special fondness for Eric, even pushing for us to live together so he could be close to his grandson. Leaving the house to Eric seemed to be his way of ensuring that connection lived on, even after his passing. When Scott called me in a panic about his father's diagnosis, I couldn't muster much sympathy. His sudden desperation felt hollow after everything that had happened. "Dad's got terminal cancer. What am I going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. I snorted bitterly. "I don't know." "What did he say when I suggested going to the hospital?" "Something about not being frail or short-lived like my parents, wasn't it?"
So deal with it yourself, Scott.
"How can you be so heartless, Amy? I never thought you'd be this kind of person." That accusation made my blood boil. "Heartless?" I snapped. "Did you ever say a single warm word when my mother was sick? Did you ever show any real concern? Reflect on your own actions, Scott." And with that, I hung up. As expected, Scott's father passed away shortly after. Despite my attempts to suppress negativity, I couldn't help but recall all the cruel things he'd said and done. I didn't shed a tear. As much as I wanted to rise above it, the wounds they had inflicted on me were too deep to ignore. After the funeral, his will was discovered, and the contents surprised everyone. Though he had always boasted about his strength and longevity, Scott's father had clearly taken the time to make detailed preparations. "The house goes to my grandson Eric," the will read. "The rest of the estate is to be divided between my wife and eldest son." I was stunned to see Eric's name. Despite his harshness toward me, Scott's father had truly cherished Eric, and this was his way of leaving behind a legacy for his beloved grandson. It was a strange feeling, partly relief that the house was no longer under Scott's control, and partly amazement at the thoughtfulness behind such a decision. For Eric, this would be a bittersweet gift. As for me, it felt like the final chapter in a story of conflict, betrayal, and loss. A chapter 1 was ready to close. "It's my house. I can do what I want with it," Eric said coolly, appearing from the side with a calm but satisfied expression as he watched the demolition. The scene was eerily reminiscent of what had happened to my own family home, and I could see the disbelief and horror etched on Scott and his mother's faces. Heavy machinery rumbled in the background, tearing down their house piece by piece, while workers moved efficiently to finish the job. "Eric, what are you doing? Stop this right now," Scott yelled, his voice cracking with panic. Eric crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Why should I?" Isn't this what you taught me, Dad? It's my property, and I can do whatever I want with it. Scott's mother gasped, clutching her chest. Eric, this is your grandparents' home. How could you? It was also my inheritance, Eric replied, his tone unwavering. And I've decided this house is more trouble than it's worth. Just like you all decided with Mom's house. Scott and his mother looked as if they'd been struck. This is completely different, Scott protested, his face red with anger. Is it? Eric shot back. You didn't care about Mom's feelings when you demolished her house. You told her it was just property, that she should thank you. So, why is this house any different? Isn't that what you always say, Dad, that families should accept things and move on? I stood there in stunned silence, unsure of what to feel. Eric's actions were bold, perhaps too bold, but I couldn't deny the poetic justice of it all. He had turned Scott's own logic against him, and the irony was impossible to ignore. Eric, please, Scott's mother pleaded. This house is everything to us.
Exactly.
It was everything to you. But you never thought about how others feel, did you? You didn't care about Mom's home or her memories. I'm just doing what I think is best. Scott looked at me, desperation in his eyes. Amy, do something. Talk to him. But I shook my head. I told Eric to renounce the inheritance, but he was happy to take it. I don't have the right to interfere. He's doing what he thinks is best, just like you did. The weight of their actions had finally come full circle. As painful as it was to watch, this moment wasn't mine to fix. For once, they were being forced to face the consequences of their choices, and there was no avoiding it. The company house from now on, I concluded, recounting the events to Scott's colleague's wife, who listened with wide eyes and a mixture of shock and understanding. Scott and his mother's fall from grace was a direct result of their actions, and though part of me felt a twinge of pity, I couldn't ignore the sense of justice that had finally prevailed. Eric had dismantled their house with the same determination they'd shown when they destroyed mine. His words still echoed in my mind. Did you apologize? Did you ever reflect on what you did to Mom? His sharp glare and unwavering stance had finally broken through their arrogance, leaving them begging and powerless. When Scott eventually paid the damages and compensation from the inherited assets, it was a long overdue acknowledgement of his wrongdoing. Eric, taking matters into his own hands, had also retrieved every single item that Scott's mother had stolen from my mother. Seeing those cherished belongings returned to me was like recovering pieces of my heart that had been taken away. You always have me and Judy, Eric had said with a warm smile, holding my hand as I broke down in tears of relief. His words reminded me that, despite the pain and betrayal, I wasn't alone. My children had stood by me through it all, giving me the strength to rebuild and move forward. Meanwhile, Scott and his mother, now confined to a small company house, had become the subject of whispers and gossip. Their reputation was tarnished, and they would likely face a hard life ahead. It wasn't something I celebrated, but it was hard to ignore the irony of their situation. For me, it was time to close this painful chapter and focus on the future. With Eric, Judy, and the love we shared, I finally felt like I could start anew. This ordeal had tested me in unimaginable ways, but it had also shown me the strength I never knew I had, and the unwavering support of the family that truly mattered. Scott and his mother's life in the company housing is a consequence of their own actions. After Scott's retirement, they'll likely face even greater challenges, forced to save up for a new place to live. Sometimes I think about asking my friend how they're doing if only to have something to talk about, but I never do. I continued staying at Judy's house for a while, grateful for her kindness and company. Then, something wonderful happened. Eric got engaged. He and his fiancée were planning to build a house, and the sale of the land from our former family home had provided a decent amount to help fund it. I felt a sense of peace, knowing that even the painful loss of that house had eventually served a purpose. Mom, come live with us, Eric offered one day, his fiancée smiling warmly beside him. She welcomed me wholeheartedly into their future plans, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep sense of belonging and hope. I couldn't keep relying on Judy, who lived alone and had been so patient with me during this turbulent time. So I decided to take Eric up on his offer. As I look forward to starting this new chapter, I'm determined to live happily with my new family. I also vow never to become the kind of mother-in-law my own was, to be supportive, kind, and understanding, the way Eric and his fiancée have been to me. This time, it truly feels like a fresh start, filled with love, warmth, and the promise of a brighter future.